Hello again, I'm Sean Keogh, prospective parliamentary candidate for UKIP in Erewash, and today I want to take a break from Brexit for a little while and talk about knife crime and stop and search because it's very much in the news. Now, Sajid Javid, the Home Secretary, says that he wants to increase police powers and make it more easy to carry out stop and search. But the problem is that this is just window dressing, it's just a sham, and it's not going to work the way that he's going about it. And let me explain why. But firstly, let me explain why the police don't stop and search anywhere near as often as they should. Firstly, it's because of the Macpherson report from 20 odd years ago after the Lawrence inquiry, when he said the police were institutionally racist, which they were not. But as a result of that accusation, the police basically abandoned stop and search because they were scared to do it for fear of being accused of racism. But secondly, in 2014, Theresa May, who was then the Home Secretary, made it even harder for stop and search to happen because she was saying that notwithstanding what I've just said, that it was still being disproportionately used against young black men, and she thought that was wrong. Of course, she had no common sense at all, because the point is that most of the knife crime is carried out by young black men. That's why they were disproportionately being searched and so on. But another reason why it's not done, stop and search, is because it's just so complicated. Also, it involves getting permission from senior officers, and they won't authorise it. You can ask them to authorise it under what's called Section 60, but they won't. And also, the officer who's doing it has to give to the person who's being stopped credible reasons why you've stopped him. But that is so impractical. You can't reveal to him why you stopped him. It might be offensive, it might be upsetting, it might be rude to say it, and it might even disclose the name or identity of someone who gave you information, perhaps. It's just not realistic to tell him why you stopped him. You have to keep that to yourself, but the law requires you to tell him. Now, the problem is that those in power have got no idea how it actually works in practice. They haven't a clue, they've never done the job, and yet they feel entitled to pontificate about how policing should be done. Now, there are two different ways in which stop and search can happen. One way is for an individual officer on his own to carry out a stop and search if he has a reasonable suspicion that in connection with the person he's stopping and searching. But the problem is that in reality, he's unlikely to have such a reasonable suspicion in accordance with the definition that the law applies. It might be a reasonable suspicion to you and me talking in a pub, but it's not reasonable suspicion to the senior officers that he has to account to. And so therefore they don't do it. And politicians speak of a thing called intelligence-led policing. Now this is just horse manure. What they're speaking of is carrying out stop and search when you have information, knowledge about the person, knowledge about this man that causes you to know that he's got a knife or may well have a knife, and it has to have nothing to do with the kind of person he is, or the age he is, or the race he is, or where he is. It's all to do with specific information about him. Well, of course, that is absolute rubbish. Just now and again, very rarely that happens, but 90% of the time, that's not what you have. What you really have is instinct-led policing, where the officer just has a feeling. He has an instinct. His experience, his instinct tells him, this one's a wrong one. This one, I don't like the look of him. I don't like the way he's looking at me. I don't like what he's doing. I just don't feel right about him. I'm going to stop and search him. That's how it works. You don't have information. You have that feeling in your gut, a gut instinct. Anyway, what Sajid Javid is doing at the moment, he's proposing to reduce the complexity of Section 60. But let me say, Section 60 is about stop and search when it's done as part of a campaign. It's not talking about individual officers carrying out an individual search when they're on their own somewhere in the streets. It's talking about organising these great big razzmatazz campaigns. And what they're saying is, what he's saying, instead of having to get a chief superintendent to sign it off and authorise it, it can be done on the say-so of an inspector. Well, that's nice as far as it goes, except that it's just a sham. The reality is no inspector will sign it off without first of all speaking to a superintendent at least. So it's not changing anything in practice. Because of the political gravity of this, officers at the rank of inspector even are just too scared to do this kind of thing without getting sign-off from a very high level. And it's just therefore unrealistic. But also Sajid Javid is proposing to change the wording in the rules to say that instead of them the police officer requiring to have a reasonable suspicion that violence will result, he just has to have a reasonable suspicion that violence may result. So they're changing the word will to may. But again, it sounds good, but it's not really going to make any difference, because in reality you don't have any information. You just have a gut instinct, most of the time. So the real work, I need to say, in relation to stop and search, the real work in relation to town centre policing is done by young junior officers. That's what perhaps the public don't realise. When you join the police, I was a police officer myself for 3 years and then a lawyer for 25 years, but when I was a bobby, the first thing they do is put you on the town centre. That's where the probationers are put to learn the job. So nearly all of this stop and search work is to be done in reality by young, inexperienced officers. And they're not going to go asking inspectors, never mind chief superintendents, for the permission to carry out stop and search campaigns. That's just not going to happen. It isn't going to happen. So the reality is that real stop and search needs to be done by individual officers as and when they need to, as and when they want to, as and when their gut instinct tells them that they should do it. And it has to therefore be random. There must be permission to do it randomly, not as part of an orchestrated campaign. Because if you carry out an orchestrated campaign, your common sense tells you, if you're going to have 25 officers in the town centre with a great big hullabaloo, and it's all in the press and it's on the radio and there's cars and everyone's making a song and dance of it, well, obviously the people with the big knives are not going to go in the town centre that day. It's just, you couldn't make it up. It's so stupid. The reason that you have to have randomized stop and search on an ad hoc one-by-one basis is so that you can catch them. You're not going to catch them if you make a great big song and dance of it. And finally, stop and search has got to be targeted. And in the same way that if you wanted to kill greenfly, you wouldn't go spraying the tarmac and spraying the road and spraying the flower beds everywhere except where the roses are. You'd focus on the roses because that's where the greenfly are. And when you are dealing with knife crime, you need, if you've got limited resources, as the police do, you need to target those who are overwhelmingly the most likely to perpetrate those offences. And the fact is, the simple, undeniable fact is that overwhelmingly the largest number of perpetrators of knife crimes are young black men. And not only that, but they're overwhelmingly the main victims of it. And then of course there are some young white men, but they're almost all young. That's the point. So who we need to be searching overwhelmingly is young men, and sometimes their girlfriends who sometimes carry the knives for them, but overwhelmingly within that group there needs to be targeting of young black men. And we need to make no apology for it, and it needs to be our default setting, our assumption that that is not racism. It's just common sense, and we need to liberate the police from this idea that doing that is racist. It isn't. It's just sheer common sense. Anyway, thank you for viewing. Please like and please share. That really helps. And I look forward to having you back next time. Thank you.